When did it all start rolling? Like, when did the government realize that they had to get actively involved in censorship, and what steps did they initially take to get involved in this?
It started in 2014 with the Ukraine fiasco, the coup and then the counter coup. The coup was great for internet free speech. I mean, you really do need to start the story of internet censorship with the story of internet freedom, because promotion of censorship is sort of the flip side of promotion of free speech. And we've had this free speech government diplomatic role for 80 years now. When World War II ended, we embarked, we had the international rules-based order that was created in 1948. We had the UN, we had NATO, we had the IMF, the World Bank. We had this big global system now. There was a prohibition in 1948 under the UN Declaration of Human Rights that you can't acquire territory by military force anymore and have it be respected by international law. So everything had to move to soft power influence. And so the U.S. government took a very active role beginning in 1948 to promote free speech around the world. And this was done through all these, initially CIA proprietaries like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And then the whole Wisner's, Wurlitzer, State Department CIA apparatus, all the early partnerships with the media and the war machine around propaganda for World War II continued through the Cold War. And then that hit the gas with promotion of free speech on the internet when the internet was privatized. It was initially a military project, so it was a government operation from Jump Street. And then in 1991, the World Wide Web came out, civilian use. And right away, the State Department, the military, our intelligence sphere was promoting free speech so that we could have a basically government pressure on foreign countries to open up their internet, to allow basically groups that the U.S. government was supporting to be able to combat state control over media in those other countries. So we already had this sort of deep interplay between government, tech companies, universities, NGOs that dates back 80 years. If you look at the evolution of NGOs like Freedom House or the Atlantic Council or Wilson Center in promoting these free speech things. So, but what happened is in 2014, we had about 25 years of successful free speech diplomacy. And then there was we tried to overthrow the government of Ukraine. We successfully did. And I'm not even arguing whether that's a good or a bad thing. But the fact is the U.S. did effectively January 6th, the Yanukovych government out of power in 2014. I mean, we literally had our Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, handing out cookies and water bottles to violent street protesters as they surrounded the Parliament building and ran the democratically elected government out of office. But then what happened is the eastern side of the state completely broke away. So we don't respect this new U.S.-installed government. Crimea voted in a referendum to join the Russian Federation. And that kicked off, that sort of set in motion the events that would end the concept of free speech diplomacy as like a U.S. government unfettered good. Because what they argued is we pumped $5 billion worth of U.S. government money into media institutions in Ukraine. That's the figure that's cited by Victoria Nuland in December 2013, right before the coup. $5 billion setting up independent media companies, basically sponsoring Mockingbird style our media assets in the region. And they still didn't penetrate eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine was primarily ethnic Russian, didn't penetrate Crimea. So they said, we need something to stop them from being able to combat our media influence. And they initially called this the Gerasimov Doctrine, named after Valery Gerasimov, who was this Russian general. They took a quote from him saying, the new nature of war is no longer about military to military conflict. All we need to do is take over the media in these NATO countries. And that's primarily social media. Get one of our pawns elected as the president, and that president will control the military. So it's much cheaper and more efficient to win a military war by simply winning civilian elections. So that was called the Gerasimov Doctrine. That's what set up the early censorship infrastructure in 2014. 3 years later, the guy who coined that, Mark Galeotti, would write a sort of mea culpa saying, oops, I'm sorry. Gerasimov was actually citing what the U.S. does. But by that point, they'd already renamed it hybrid warfare. NATO formally declared its tanks to tweets doctrine, saying that the new role of NATO is no longer just about tanks. It's about controlling tweets. And then Brexit happened in June 2016. In July 2016, the very next month in Warsaw, NATO added hybrid warfare to its formal charter, basically authorizing the military, the diplomatic sphere, and the intelligence world to take control over social media. And then 5 months later, Trump won the election, being called a Russian asset. So all that infrastructure was redirected home to the U.S.
Jesus. Whew. It was looking pretty bleak, I would say, in terms of the direction internet censorship was headed. It seemed like the censorship machine was winning up until around the time that Elon purchased X. That seems to me to be our fork in the road. That's the alternative timeline. You know, Mark Andreessen talked about that yesterday, that we've had a couple of alternative timelines where things have shifted. I think that was one of the big ones.
No, that's exactly it. I mean, he's sort of the timeline where we missed the bullet, is where there's a Deus ex machina. You know, it's sort of like a Deus ex machina, where it's this random plot thing that happens. You know, someone descends onto the stage and solves all the plot's loopholes and magically saves the plucky heroes that were otherwise in danger. There were events in the run-up. Well, it all sort of happened simultaneously, really, because the month that Elon announced his acquisition was the same month that the Disinformation Governance Board was announced at DHS, which was the first thing that really roused Republicans and, frankly, anyone with institutional power in D.C. to finally stare into the sun and recognize, or at least begin to glimpse, the size of what they were up against. The Disinformation Governance Board set off a flurry of congressional activity from Chuck Grassley and other luminaries in Congress. There's whistleblower documents came out, and for years, the entire Republican Party and most of the Democrat Party had denied the existence of government censorship, and it, frankly, the Ministry of Truth was not the Disinformation Governance Board. The Ministry of Truth had already existed 3 years earlier at DHS. They just called it a name that masked what it did. It was called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is a name that puts you half to sleep by the time you're finished saying it.